welcome back to the channel. I read 5 books in November and I wanted to do a little wrap up talking about them. 5 books isn't as good as I wanted it to be. I kind of was hoping to read a bit more in November, but I'm still kind of, I guess, in a transition phase where I'm realizing I'm not listening to as many audiobooks and I'm not prioritizing reading physically as much as I should. In the first week of November, I had a little challenge where I made myself read for an hour every day, and I did that, and that was great. And then after that, I didn't intentionally set that time, and so then just kind of wasn't, and ended up doom scrolling a lot, if we're honest. So something I'm really going to try doing going forward is actually kind of prioritizing and scheduling time into my day for reading. Otherwise, I forget about it. Still pretty happy with 5 books in general. You know, 5 is still pretty decent. So let's talk about the 5 books. So of the 5 books, 4 of them were adults, 1 book was YA, and I had a completely 5 different split in terms of genre. I had a paranormal horror, a contemporary thriller, I guess, a fantasy, a mystery, and a romantasy. The oldest of those books was from 1932, and the newest was from this year in February. So that's quite a difference as well in like just time scale. I thought that was quite a cool little stat. I continued 1 series, but I did start 3 new series, so not great in that sense, although one of those new series was up to date. And I listened to 2 books completely on audio, and then 3 books I did mixed. The 3 books that were like mixed audio and physical were from my physical TBR. However, 2 of them were book club books that I had bought for the book club, so they'd only been on my physical TBR for about a month. So not great stats in that sense, but again, overall, I'm pretty happy with that. In terms of star ratings, it was a pretty decent month. I had 1 3-star, 2 3.5s, and 2 4 stars. So let's get into the books. I'll go through them in kind of like chronological order, but the first book I read for the month was actually probably my favorite for the month, and that was an audiobook, and that was Craven Manor by Darcy Coates. So this is a horror paranormal book following our main character Daniel. He is a bit down on his luck, in need of some money, in need of a job. He's living with his cousin and is just not in the best like financial situation, and then he gets a very mysterious job offer. It's kind of just like delivered in the post in like a little bit of a letter, and he's very suspicious about it, but he's in dire need that he decides to go with it. It's a job offer for a grounds person at a place called Craven Manor. He's never heard of this. He's given a set of instructions how to get there. It's very off the beaten track. It's very kind of tucked away. He goes there. There's no one there, but there is another note there with a little bit of money, and this position also comes with a place on the property. So he decides, you know what, it sounds too good to be true, but I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna go for it and see how it pans out. He takes the money, realizes that it's real because it's these like really old coins and it's a lot of money. So he is thinking, you know, he's hit the jackpot here. But he's also, when he gets this job, given a list of kind of like rules. Don't go into a particular room, a particular wing in the house. Don't come out of his little hut at night. Don't open windows. All of this stuff. But again, he decides it seems a bit weird, but I'm going to go for it. And then things start happening at night. The contact he has in these letters is from this kind of like his employer, who he never sees, but the employer keeps like leaving notes for him or like fulfilling his requests for certain items. And he's very suspicious of that. And then at nighttime, things start happening. He hears things outside of his house, although he doesn't leave. And then he sees a light going on in the wing that he's not supposed to go into. So there's all of this stuff that's happening. The story kind of progresses from there with this kind of paranormal mystery. Now, this is a pretty short book. It's under 300 pages, but despite that, it did feel slightly slow, but in a way that was quite cozy for me. Like, I quite enjoyed this. It wasn't the most scary book that I've ever read, and so I think it's definitely like quite a decent maybe intro if you've never read a horror book before and you don't mind a little slow read. I think this one would be quite decent. Daniel as a character, I think, was quite well fleshed out. I feel like his reasonings for doing what he did were solid, and also like the way that he reacted to certain things, I feel like was understandable for his life situations. I really liked the paranormal element to this book and how the things ended up presenting themselves, kind of what they ended up being, and how like the little twists and turns, how they concluded at the end. And then I really liked Daniel's progression of relationship with this benefactor, the employer of this house. They kind of, how very slowly but surely this kind of like friendship-esque or like a relationship-esque develops between them. I kind of at one point thought it was maybe we're going to go into a bit of like an Achillean relationship, a bit of a gay relationship. It didn't. I feel like that would have been quite fun, but it didn't. But like, just would have been a nice little element. But I still enjoyed their kind of developing like friendship relationship, employee relationship. Anyway, I thought it was quite nice. If you are a hardcore gory slasher horror fan, this probably wouldn't be for you, but if you like the idea of like a slower paranormal story, I think this would be a really good recommendation. So yeah, definitely my favorite for the month. This one was a 4-star. So then for the first of my mixed reads, my physical TBR, and my first book club book, and that was The Housemaid by Frida McFarlane. In this book, we are following Millie, who is again also down on her luck. She is an ex-convict, just recently fired from her job and in desperate need of a job. Again, she's living out of her car, doesn't want to to break her parole. She doesn't want to go back to jail. And then she gets this offer of a job to be a live-in housemaid for this woman named Nina. Nina is very rich. She has one child and a husband, and basically ends up hiring Millie to be a live-in housemaid. The room that Millie is going to live in, though, is a bit weird. It's like tucked away upstairs in an attic room, and it locks, but from the outside. So Millie is a bit like cautious about it, but again, she's in desperate need, so she decides to go for it. And then Nina, when she starts actually working for Nina ends up being very weird and horrible and a bit erratic in her moods. Millie is so desperate for money that she kind of sticks it out. She decides to try and put up with it because this position, again, is beyond what she could have imagined and hoped for. The book itself is separated into kind of like, I guess, 3 distinctive chunks. So that's kind of most of what the first chunk kind of entails. I cannot really say much else about the second ones because there are twists that end up happening that are like big driving forces for the next kind of chunks of the story. Overall, again, I quite enjoyed this story. I have read, this is my 5th Freida McFadden, and it's not my favourite. Most of Freida McFadden's characters that you read from, I don't personally find very likeable, and Millie isn't really any different from that. She does some actions in the first part of this book that I don't agree with, despite the situation that she's in, and it really just shines a bit of a light for her character for me that I just don't agree with. So like, I didn't necessarily like her, so I was following the story along more for the plot line and for the potential twists and turns that are going to happen, as opposed to her as a character. There is a bit of the shift I mentioned again in the part, and I actually ended up preferring the second part a bit more than Millie in the first part. And I found that a bit more of a compelling story and a bit more of a faster pace once you got into that section of the book. Things I felt like picked up a bit more. Towards the end of the first part, I felt like things were dragging a bit and it was a bit same old and like, what's going to happen? But like, once we hit that second part, things became a bit more interesting and they kind of picked up steam for me. All in all, I thought it was a decent read. Like I said, not my favourite Freida McFadden. My favourite Freida McFadden is Never Lie. I actually really liked that one, but it has compelled me enough to be interested to continue the series. This is a 3-book series, and I'm interested to see what the different books entail, if they're going to be quite different or if they're going to kind of be similar, the same old, basically, just in a new book. I think that'll be quite interesting. I'm interested in seeing the movie because that's kind of why we ended up reading this for book club, because there is a movie with Amanda Seyfried and Sydney Sweeney coming out that I will probably watch it down the road just to kind of see the adaptation of it. I do think Amanda Seyfried is miscast. I really like her as an actor, but like the way that Nina is described is very not Amanda Seyfried, but I'm interested to see how she portrays that character. I feel like most people have probably read this, but if you are interested and intrigued, I would give it a read. Like, I feel like Freida McFadden's books are, you maybe have to suspend your disbelief slightly when you read them, but I feel like they are interesting and bingeable enough, but they are not like ones that are going to leave huge lasting impacts, but they are nice sometimes, I think, breaks in between heavier books to kind of just read and binge and kind of just be like, what the hell am I reading? Like, have like a little bit of a twist and a turn, and then afterwards I don't. Actually, I feel like I have thought about some of them before, especially Never Lie. I think really didn't quite impress me with its twists in that. That one is a bit more slow than this. This one I think is a little bit faster paced, but I did still quite enjoy that. So yeah, I thought most people have read this though, and I do think I can see the appeal of why so many people gravitated to this book, and like, I guess if they've never read thrillers before, I think it's probably quite a good introductory thriller, and why it kind of like ended up popping off for her a bit. I can kind of see that. But yeah, this was fine. This was a 3 point. No, this was my 3 star. So this was technically my lowest rated book of the month. Then we have another physical TBR book, and that is Shadow of the Fox by Julie Kagawa. This is the one that I've had on for the longest. This is a fantasy YA. It's set in a world where basically there is a scroll that can summon a dragon. When this happens, the human that summons the dragon can basically grant a wish, and it can be quite devastating because it usually ends up being something of great greed or great power. So this scroll is split into parts and sent to different temples to protect them. So we are in the temple of, I can't remember what it's called, the Wind, I think, maybe, or something, where our main character, Yumiko, who is half kitsune, half human, lives. And she ends up discovering about this scroll, that this temple has been protecting it, when their temple is attacked by a bunch of demons trying to retrieve this scroll. She is given the task to take the scroll to one of these other temples where it can be protected even further, but she doesn't actually know where this temple is, so she has to go to the capital of Japan, I think it's the capital, to basically find someone who knows where this temple is, where she can then go to that temple. So that's kind of her journey. This is a split POV. We meet our main male character, who is Tatsumi. He is a shinobi of the Shadow Clan, and his is sent on a mission to retrieve the scroll. So he gets to the temple just as it's being attacked and runs into Yumiko, who basically ends up telling him that the scroll has been sent ahead to this temple and she needs to go there. And kind of they end up deciding to go together, him kind of as her bodyguard because she knows where she's going, and her kind of tricking / lying to him to protect her, because he doesn't know she has the scroll. She kind of knows that if he knew that she had the scroll, he would try and take it from her, so she has to keep it a secret. So they end up bounding together to go on this journey to these temples. So then the rest of the story very much is a travel journey, and along the way they have kind of like little pocket arcs of like kind of monster of the week-esque kind of storylines, where they will run into a monster or like run into a situation where they have to then like resolve it, and then that gets resolved, and then they kind of carry on the journey, and it's like another little one, and along the way they end up like kind of picking up companions. And I really liked this kind of like journey layout. A lot of this book, because I guess because it is Japanese mythology very much inspired, had a kind of anime feel in that sense of this travel journey. One of my favorite manga anime series is Sayuki, which is Journey to the West, and that very much is a traveling series of a group of companions traveling and fighting these kind of getting into situations in different towns where they have to end up helping the towns or resolving a situation. And that kind of was a similar-esque concept. So they have the overall plot for this book, but also this travel journey, which I did quite enjoy. I did have some things that I didn't love about this book. First of all, the switching POVs. I do think actually Yuki Kagawa did a good job of making the different narrative voices quite distinct, but just in the book in general, there was no indication when the POVs switched at the beginning of the chapters. You know, usually we'll just have the character's name. They didn't do that, and it isn't the first person's perspective for both of the POVs. It was just a bit jarring that like it didn't tell me straight away. It did very easily get into the rhythm that it was one after the other, but there ends up being 3 different POVs in this book. There was one that isn't a first person perspective, and I wasn't sure for a lot of the book how that character was actually involved in this POV. It does end up coming towards the end. Her POV ends up being as a bit of a place point for the like antagonist of the series. But yeah, there was just not that distinctiveness in the POV. And then also I found something really odd with the writing in that it includes a lot of Japanese, or like at least the like romanization of Japanese words in the spoken text. And this isn't like for the words like shinobi or yokai, like Japanese words for things, but it was like Japanese words in sentences when characters were talking to each other would just be added in for, I'm not really sure why, because it kind of took me out of the story a bit, because it felt like a distinctive kind of break in the narrative. I am someone that has studied a little bit of Japanese before, so I knew, and all the words that they were using in the text was quite basic words, so I did know what the words meant without them having to explain it, although they did explain it. But it felt very out of pocket. It took me out of the story a bit when it did this, because the characters, it's set in Japan and the characters are all in theory speaking to each other in Japanese, but the book's obviously written in English. So then having the random Japanese word added in to the speech of 2 characters that are clearly speaking in Japanese to each other felt really out of pocket, because it wasn't like they were always speaking in English and then adding the random like Japanese word in. They were always speaking to each other in Japanese. So then like just having this random word was it kind of just took me out of the story a bit. I'm going to try and give you guys an example. And then like, okay, here, so it's like said, a pain through my leg making me grasp. Eat there, I whispered. And then it says in like italicized, ouch. So ito meaning ouch. It just felt very odd that it included the Japanese. Like I'm guessing it was just kind of part of, I guess, to share like the Japanese language a bit more with, as well as like all this mythology and culture and stuff. But it kind of was, I think writing style wise was a weird choice. And it did take me out of the story a bit, because like in my head, they were always talking to each other in Japanese. So like why am I having the 1 or 2 random words in Japanese? The writing style itself was actually a very easy writing style. I was intrigued enough overall by the story. I did enjoy it, and I am going to carry on with it. I do own the whole trilogy, so I will be carrying on with it. Yumiko as a character, I actually feel like her characterization changed a bit during the story. At the beginning, she kind of came off a lot more confrontational, and then she ended up being someone that was a bit more naive and didn't know a lot of stuff, and a bit like kind of very kind of maybe airheady, where she kind of just goes along with things. But it's kind of character that kind of endears a lot of people to her. Yeah, she had a bit of a sheltered upbringing, so she didn't know a lot of stuff about the world, so she was quite naive in that sense. And then Tatsumi is a very kind of like stoic character. He's been trained his whole life to kind of essentially be an assassin, so like doesn't engage with people outside of his clan, and so doesn't really build these bonds with people. So they're kind of like very slowly building relationship was quite nice. I'm guessing it's going to turn into a romance in the future. This was very not romance heavy at all, so if you're looking for like a YA series that has very little romance, this would be potentially an interesting one. I love the Japanese mythology included in this. I loved seeing all the different kind of monsters and creatures that came out. So yeah, overall, I had a decent time with it. At 3.5, I will be carrying on with the series. So then for my 4th book was Peril at End House. This was another audiobook, and this is my continuation of the Hercule Poirot series by Agatha Christie. This was the one that was from 1932. This I actually really ended up enjoying. This was a 4-star read for me. It was about our detective Hercule Poirot and his friends Captain Hastings. They are on holiday together. While they are on holiday, they basically end up kind of bumping into this woman at lunch, and they kind of then then realise that this woman is potentially being targeted by an assassin. Poirot decides to get on this case, investigate this while also trying to protect her, and then in the course of him doing this, a body turns up. So that kind of then lights a fire under him that he is determined to figure this out, who is trying to kill this woman and for what purpose. That is literally all I'm going to say about it. It was a very short audiobook, so I assume the book's quite short. That is like the whole story, is this one mystery. I really enjoyed this mystery, actually. I thought this was a really, really well contained mystery. All of these like little odds and ends that ended up kind of tying back around at the end. Just really enjoyed it. There's not much I can say about it, as it is like, it would really spoil it, and I think it's good to go into these ones pretty blind. I actually would recommend this one as maybe a good starting point for the Poirot series. You don't need to read them in order because the timelines do jump around throughout the different books. You kind of go back and forth where sometimes Hercule Poirot is in retirement, sometimes he's not. He is technically, I think, in this one, so he kind of gets himself on the case because like he's there and he likes to help people. But yeah, I think this was actually one of my favorites for the ones that I've read so far, so I would really recommend this one. I thought the conclusion of the mystery was really satisfying, and how, yeah, I never see any of these coming. I never really am able to figure them out, but I always have a good time with them. And then the fifth and final book, my other 3.5 star, was Direbound. This was my other book club book, and this again was a mixed. I did a little bit of audio and a little bit of physical reading for this one. This is the adult romantasy book. This is about Merrin. She is, I think, 23. She's in her 20s, and she is a bit of a street fighter. She is the kind of sole provider at the moment for her family. She lives with her mum and her younger sister. Her mum's quite ill. In her country, they are in war with the people from the north, I think it is, but they are basically Scythans, which are vampires. Their country is a country of some individuals who have bound to direwolves over the years, and they are kind of the biggest protectors of the country. They are the strongest warriors. They get like the most perks, all of this stuff. But in their little city of where Merrin lives, she lives near the capital, or it's the capital, or it's like near where the king lives. And basically in their city, children are getting kidnapped and going missing by things called the grabbers, and they are basically being taken to the Scythans because children's blood is like the most precious to Scythans. At the very beginning of the story, Merrin's sister ends up getting taken. Merrin ends up being quite desperate, so she enlists in the army, and she doesn't realise when she does so that that this year is going to be a bonding year. These happen randomly, where everyone who applies for the army has to go on this bonding trial. You have to run up a mountain and try and basically bond with a direwolf. She ends up getting thrown into this, so she has to do this trial. You don't have to bond with a direwolf. If you can get to the top and survive, you don't have to. You can like choose to not bond with a direwolf, and then in doing so, you would get sent to the front. This is what Merrin intends to do because she wants to get to the front of the war so she can try and slip over into Scythan territory to find her sister. However, this does not go to plan, and she does end up getting bonded to a direwolf who is a bit of a standoffish direwolf. She doesn't really communicate with Merrin, and Merrin isn't very happy about the situation, but she's bonded, and once bonded, basically you can't break it. So she ends up having to go to the kingdom and do these bonded trials, which is like a 3 or 4 month long trials. There are different elements you have to learn about being bonded to your direwolf, the different pack elements with these different packs of direwolves, and all of that. So that's kind of like how the story progresses. It hits a lot of very typical, I think, romantasy beats in terms of like trials. There is somewhat of a love triangle in this. I say somewhat because it doesn't really feel like a love triangle, because I feel like as the reader you kind of know where the story is going to go. One of our love interests doesn't really play a big part until later in the series, and one of our love interests is kind of a love interest from the very beginning. Having though this first love interest basically off the bat did mean that we got into some spicy scenes very early on in the book, which I just don't really care about after 50 pages of a book. And there were quite a few of them in here, and I did end up skipping a few. I'd very like skimmed read them because I was like, sometimes they have like integral parts of the plot somewhat woven in. They didn't really in any of these, so if you are interested in Direbound but not overly big and spice scenes, you can skip most of the spice scenes, and they don't really have much of an impact in terms of the plot. So as like an isolated story, thinking of nothing else that I've read, I actually thought this was pretty okay. I thought it was pretty decent. I enjoyed most of the trials. The element of with the direwolf, sometimes there is quite a brutality to these trials, which I think is also a bit of a trend in romantasy, which I didn't love. Actually, some of the scenes were quite gruesome in terms of like direwolves attacking humans. They were quite gruesome, but I thought they were well done, like very pacey. Understood everything that was going on, so very well executed in that, and like very bingeable in that sense. There were a few like twists and turns in this book, a few plot reveals that again were interesting, not again the most unique thing, but interesting enough to keep my like interest, and also probably would compel me to want to carry on with the series, which I think the next book comes out next year. However, not looking at this as an isolated story, there was no way that I could not draw comparisons to Fourth Wing when reading this book. It felt very, very similar. And I don't think Fourth Wing is necessarily the first to do all of these tropes, like it's not the blueprint, but I feel like it did them in such a popular way and such a widespread way that there is no way that the authors of this, who are people that say they love fantasy, have not read Fourth Wing. And so like a lot of the beats that it was hit with, like in terms of like the bonding, in terms of some of the trials, in terms of some of the characters that died, in terms of some of the characters that relate to our main character and how they relate to the grander scheme of the world, it felt very Fourth Wing, and I could not draw that comparison when reading the book. And that's not to say this was necessarily worse than Fourth Wing or better. It just like, it was very hard to not draw those comparisons, especially when it got into a certain element with one of my least favorite tropes in romantasy, which I won't say what it is because it would spoil something, but the moment it's mentioned in this, you know as a reader who it's going to be between this little trope. And it was basically the exact same thing in Fourth Wing in terms of that. And it's something that I don't like as a trope necessarily, because I feel like it forces characters together outside of having a genuine reason to force them together. Overall, I thought this was fine, though didn't really care about the romance though. I felt there was a good balance between romance and fantasy. And actually, for our main character Merrin in general, I actually did go read through some of the reviews, and a lot of people didn't like her. I actually didn't dislike her, and I felt her frustration in her ignorance. She is a commoner, and there's only actually 2 commoners that end up bonding with direwolves. Everyone else are from dire-bound families, so they have been around direwolves their whole life. They know about the situation, they know about this like ins and outs. So she is very much out of the loop of this. And a lot of the time though, people don't really explain to Merrin the ins and outs of direwolves and the pack and all of this, as she's kind of just expected to know it. And so I did feel her frustration in that, in some situations where she would do things because she didn't know any better, and then people would blame her for not knowing the things that she hasn't been told about. But then also she herself didn't present sometimes enough curiosity in that sense to ask questions. Her and the other commoner are given this specific class where they are taught about the dire-bound history, and she doesn't pay much interest in it. So then also that appears in that. Overall, I thought the story was fine. I am going to carry on with it. I actually also, though, do find sometimes in reading this kind of style of romantasy, or even just fantasy in general, a bit jarring with the way that it's written, because it's written in a very modern day style, but it's set in a very medieval-esque setting. There is no electricity. If you think medieval, like that's very much the world it's set in. But then like the terminology used, like she used gaslight at one point, used that kind of modern day terminology, but in a medieval setting, I always find it slightly jarring. And I do find sometimes the audiobook narrators for romantasies all end up sounding the same. Like I didn't look into who they were, and if I have listened to them before, but I always feel like they sound very similar. And so sometimes that takes me out of the book a bit. What I did like about the audiobook, however, though, this is a single POV throughout most of the book, and I told in the first person's perspective. However, we had 2 audiobook narrators. So every time a male would speak in this book, a male would narrate the audiobook. So I actually ended up really appreciating that. So even though the male had no POV, every time a male would speak, he still used that. And that just was really helpful, because sometimes as well, whenever a like female or vice versa, they do the opposite gender's like narration, sometimes it takes me out of the book a bit, because it will be sound ever so slightly funny, or also it's like different to how the other audiobook narrator has narrated that part. But anyway, that was just a little bit. But yeah, overall, I think if you're into romantasy, you would probably quite enjoy this. It is pretty typical from what I've read so far in the romantasy sphere. It doesn't do anything I don't think necessarily new, but I did also enjoy the element of the dire wolves. I do like a wolf in a story, so I liked that element. I liked the idea of the pack. I didn't like the brutality in certain parts, but I liked how the story towards the end of this book ended up kind of shining some light on some of these realities of this world, and I'm interested to see where it goes, because it's definitely going to have a bit of a different thematical theme in the next book. This was very trial focused. That kind of was a big forefront of this book, so it'll be interesting to see the shift in the narrative in the next book. That was my month in November. Good reading month overall. I do, like as mentioned, need to really try and start properly remembering to schedule some time into physical reading, because if I don't do things like that, I just don't think about things like that. My memory is naff. So yeah, that's what my plan is, at least in December. I had a great reading month. Let me know your favourite book if you want to for November. I'd love to know. And if not, why don't you leave me a little wolf emoji in the comments. Let me know you made it this far if you did. Thank you guys so much for watching. I always really appreciate it. And I'll see you again soon in a couple more days for more Bookmas. Bye!